Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Addressing Homelessness, Professional Boundaries, and Ethics when Working with People who have SMI and CODs. This is the first webinar in the PATH Effective Outreach and Engagement Services series. My name is Zach Stewart, and I am going to be your producer for today's event. So I'm just going to kick us off with a couple housekeeping slides before we get started. This event is being recorded, and the audio is now broadcasting, so everyone should be hearing my voice. We are providing audio via your computer speakers today, but we are able to connect you via phone if you aren't able to connect via computer. We strongly encourage you to use the computer audio if possible, so please just choose one audio source. If you're hearing my voice through both the phone and the computer, you can hang up the phone. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services or the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are providing live captioning for today's webinar. Click the link on the screen to access the captions, and we've also provided this link in the All Questions box, which is located right beneath the slides. The captions will open in a new window or tab, and you can position that anywhere you like on your screen, and you can adjust the size, color, and speed of those captions. Your line is going to be muted for the duration of today's presentation. We do have several ways you can communicate with us. We've got that public chat box, which you can see right underneath my picture, right to the right of the slides, and I see many of you have already started typing in there. Just be aware anything you type in there is going to be visible to everybody in the room. We also have that All Questions box I mentioned. That's going to be located right beneath the slides, and we're going to ask you to use that for just all your questions, tech and content questions. We got a lot of people in the room today, so the chat box is going to be moving fast, so please make sure to put all your questions in that All Questions box, just so we can keep track of them for the Q&A session at the end of today's event. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our moderator today, Kate Rio. Kate, are you with us?
I am. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for attending today, taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm going to start off with introducing Thiessen. Thiessen Thomas is currently the Director of the Division of State and Community Systems Development within the Center for Mental Health Services at SAMHSA. In this role, he manages staff who oversee and monitor the mental health block grants, the Projects for Assistance in Transition from Homelessness grants, the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness grants, the Minority Fellowship Program grants, and several other contracts and grants. He has more than 25 years of diverse experience in the healthcare field at the local, state, and federal levels, and holds a master's degree in social work and has managed a variety of grant programs, contracts, and initiatives. Thiessen came to SAMHSA after serving in a leadership role at the state level where he directed statewide initiatives to implement evidence-based practices and programs in the mental health and substance abuse systems, the mental health block grants, certain Medicaid programs and initiatives, and he has also served as a clinical care manager with managed care organizations and worked as a clinician in outpatient, inpatient, and crisis settings. So, Thiessen, would you like to welcome people?
Sure. Thank you, Kate. And on behalf of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, I welcome all of you to this webinar titled Professional Boundaries and Ethics for Direct Services Providers Working with People Experiencing Homelessness and Serious Mental Illness or Co-occurring Disorders. As Kate mentioned, Projects for Assistance in Transition from Homelessness is one of the SAMHSA Homeless Grant Program that goes to the states and territories. There are more than 450 providers across the country that provide PATH-related services. PATH providers literally meet people where they are. Virtually all states use PATH funds to provide outreach services to contact and engage people who are disconnected from mainstream services. So in 2019 alone, PATH provider agencies contacted approximately 150,000 people through outreach. Of these, more than half of those people who are outreached are enrolled into PATH-funded services. As you know from the title of this webinar, it is important for us to remember that ethics, professionalism, and boundaries are intertwined. Working with those experiencing homelessness require not only a deep understanding of the problem, but also taking care of ourselves. PATH providers don't contact people just once. Outreach and engagement can be a lengthy process that require patience, persistence, and flexibility. So I hope this webinar will provide you some very good tips about ethics and professional boundaries. So I thank the SAMHSA's contractor, HHRN, for putting this together. Especially I thank Kate Rio and Sherry Downing for helping us with this, as well as Zach, who is our technical assistance person. So once again, I thank each of you for attending this webinar, and I thank you for being there for the people who need you the most. Kate, back to you.
Thank you, Thiessen. So our agenda for today is our welcome that Thiessen just did, and I'm going to be introducing our next presenters in a few minutes. We're going to talk about defining professional boundaries in outreach and engagement, ethical codes and their importance, and then we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So please, if you hear something while the presenters are talking, type in a question into that question and answer box, and then we will go ahead and state that question out loud for the presenters to answer it as soon as we give that to them, and we'll let them learn and help you with it. The learning objectives include identify boundary issues in outreach practices, and you should be able to understand ethical implications in building relationships with clients as soon as this is the webinar is finished. So now I would like to introduce Sherry Downing and Terry. Sherry Downing is a Senior Program Manager for AHP and the Deputy Director for SAMHSA's Homeless and Housing Resource Network. She is nationally recognized for her expertise in addressing homelessness and housing issues, particularly in rural and frontier areas. She has expertise in the issues that lead to and sustain homelessness in rural and urban environments, including poverty, domestic and sexual violence, trauma, chemical dependencies, mental health disorders, and co-occurring disorders. She has participated in creating several resources on a range of topics, including substance use treatment, homelessness prevention, youth homelessness, veteran homelessness, Medicaid as a resource for addressing chronic homelessness, and more. She is currently the chair for a local public housing authority's Board of Commissioners. After Sherry presents, we'll get to hear from Terry Cooley-Bennett. Terry is a licensed clinical social worker in Missouri, a licensed specialist clinical social worker in Kansas, a co-occurring disorders professional diplomat in Missouri, and a tobacco treatment specialist. She holds a bachelor's degree in social work from Missouri Western State University and a master's degree in social work from the University of Kansas. She is experienced in homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, sexual exploitation, trauma, and poverty. Currently, Terry is the outreach supervisor at Swope Health Services and oversees the homeless program. She speaks and serves on the board for the National Association of Social Workers, Missouri chapter, and trained with the National Association of Social Workers Office of Ethics and Professional Review. For over 20 years, she has been a speaker and workshop presenter for various agencies and groups in Missouri and Kansas, and presented numerous times on a national level. So now I would like to hand it over to Sherry Downing to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Kate. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited that you're here and we get to talk about defining professional boundaries for the first part of this. I think that is one of the things that can be most difficult for people who are working directly and closely with people experiencing homelessness. So it's an important conversation, and I am going to encourage you to please type in the chat box as we go along and add what you're seeing or what you're thinking, because I know this is something that affects every single one of you. So because this is coming sort of from a PATH perspective, because it was sponsored by PATH, that's Projects for Assistance in Transition from Homelessness, I'm going to say many of the people who are listening probably have some PATH affiliation. So who are PATH clients? PATH clients must be seriously mentally ill or seriously mentally ill with co-occurring substance use disorders. And they must be homeless or at risk of homelessness. So in this case, we're talking about a fairly narrow cohort. States have the latitude to determine the population served, of course, within the parameters set by the legislation. But most, as Thiessen told you, most of the states will focus on serving people who are the most vulnerable. Sorry about that. Who are the most vulnerable, and those who are living in unsheltered situations. So those are the folks that we'll be talking about to a great degree. So the PATH provider's job or the outreach worker's job, this could be healthcare for the homeless, it could be veterans, it could be PATH, but the job of the outreach worker is really to engage and provide case management and services to people who are experiencing homelessness. And you work hard to build trusting therapeutic relationships. Activities, there's a whole range of activities, from meeting clients where they are and visiting them where they're sleeping, to making frequent and consistent contact and helping people meet their needs. Essentially, it comes down to whatever it takes. And people who are working with this clientele really, I'll just remind, need to let the client drive the bus. If you are working harder than the client to solve the problems, then that becomes a problem in and of itself, and one of the roots of boundary issues. It's a little bit easier to set boundaries and keep them in office-based practices. If you're sitting behind a desk, it's really clear what your role is. It can be pretty easy to set those client staff boundaries. The time that you're with someone in an office-based setting is limited. It's in boundaried, it's already boundaried by the time that the appointment is set for, and you're only working during working hours. You're not in the person's living environment. There's clear expectations. You're there to perform certain kinds of work, and even if you are, of course, if you are forming a relationship with this client and helping to get this client to self-sufficiency, you're still, there's still clear expectations and roles. So it's a tiny bit easier than for outreach workers who are actually meeting people where they are. Boundaries for outreach workers are complicated. I think you all can sympathize with this. People are working in various community locations and engaging in a range of activities. I have visited many people under bridges and in encampments and way out in the woods and in tents. And it's a whole different feeling than when you're engaging with people in an office location. So you might be offering food and beverages, blankets, clothing, meal coupons, sunscreen, insect repellent. Those are really good tools for engaging with people. If you bring something they need, it can be one way to begin establishing a trusting relationship. And even if someone is living in a tent in the woods, if you're there, if you're in that person's environment, you're visiting them at their home, which puts things also on sort of a different footing. Relationships tend to shift a little bit. This is a population that has a great deal of difficulty trusting and forming relationships. And so the relationships are always in a state of transformation and growing and changing and shifting. The double-edged sword part of that is that clients may come or often will come to view you as a friend. So boundaries get blurred in those situations. One of the things I want to stress as we talk about this is outreach workers and really even people working in office settings, anybody who's working with people experiencing extreme trauma, and which is the very definition of homelessness, see the devastating effects of homelessness. I often say that there are no two stories that are exactly the same, and there are no happy stories. There are sometimes happy endings, but there are no happy stories. The effects are devastating. We see this every single day when we're working with people experiencing homelessness. It's painful and it's hard, and you internalize what you're seeing in your own heart, because you really don't come to this work unless you have a sincere desire to help and a real belief in the strength of the people that you're working with. You are often working with people who are symptomatic, who are really showing all the effects of their illness, and that can make it really complicated and difficult. At the same time, these are people who feel hopeless and powerless and angry and afraid. And this puts you in a position where you're holding someone's fragile self without much in the way of a safety net. You also, in these situations, lack direct oversight. You're often out there with a partner, but not necessarily with a supervisor. And I will just go out on a limb here and say, you are people who want to go the extra mile for your clients. You want to make a difference. You want to help. And so this also can be one of the dynamics that can cause crumbling boundaries between you and your clients. I like this slide because it really shows the zone of effective involvement. If you're under-involved, if you become calloused, or if you put enough of a distance between you and your clients that you can't feel the empathy that's needed to help, if you're under-involved, you're not going to be very effective. And if you're over-involved, if you have taken this person into your heart to the extent that you are thinking about it in your off hours and you can't get it off your mind and you can't shut it off, and you are showing up every single day and wringing your hands and worrying, you're not going to be real effective either. There's a zone of effective involvement that balances under-involvement and over-involvement to be able to just give what the person needs at the time they need it in the right amount. And that is the zone that we are working toward. So professional boundaries, what do? They set clear limits that allow for safe connections. I would underline safe connections, and if I give this presentation again, I will. I think that that's what we're really talking about here, is providing a safe place where people can be known and can reach for the help that they need from you as staff. It's being friendly, but it isn't being friends. There's a clear distinction. It's knowing where you end and the client begins. We're kind of back to the zone of safe engagement there, where you end and the client begins. You can sympathize and empathize and help and mentor and advocate, but at the end of the day, you'll go home and close your door and take a bath or drink a cup of hot cocoa or whatever it takes to sort of decompress and release some of the secondary trauma that you've experienced all day long, and your client will go on with his or her day and and keep moving forward, hopefully. Professional boundaries mean developing an understanding of the limits and responsibilities of your role as a service provider. One of the things that's super important to remember is that if you fall back into your role and you understand the parameters of your role and your responsibilities as a service provider, that can be a protective factor for you and for your client. I think this is one of my hard things. Don't do for your clients what they can do for themselves. Don't do for your clients what they can do for themselves. We want to take people by the hand and help them and provide and encourage and sometimes push. But we really do need to let the client drive the bus and begin making his or her own progress. And one thing that it's important to remember, one thing that it's so important to remember is that crises may be a natural consequence of someone's behavior, and that's okay. We're working with adults, and adults sometimes make mistakes and carry consequences, and that's okay. That is not on you. That is part of the human experience. There's a few clear lines. I like to bring up a few. Don't give or loan money. Don't take clients to your home. Don't establish transactional relationships. No, if you do this, I'll give you that. What else? Can you type a few things in the box for me? I would appreciate that. What are some of the really clear lines that you can name that would be boundaries that you really shouldn't cross with your homeless client, with your clients experiencing homelessness? Don't accept gifts, absolutely. Answering calls at 1 a.m., very good. Sharing personal experiences, friending on Facebook, child care, and it's moving really fast, so I'm only picking up a few. Don't lie for them, that is excellent. Don't share private information, cash, dual relationships. I will say, since we're all adults here, don't have sex with your clients is a clear relationship boundary. Buying things for them, making promises you can't keep. Absolutely. Thank you for that. I know we all have an awareness of some of the clear lines. There are different types of boundaries. So some examples are physical. So it could be inappropriate touching. It could be any touching. There are many, many clients who are very sensitive to being touched. And I always ask permission before I touch someone or hug someone. As I get older, I've become more of a hugger, and I don't hug anyone at this point without asking. I have seen case managers who will walk into someone's apartment and go through cupboards and closets. That's a clear physical boundary violation. You don't look through somebody's mail. You observe your personal space. You don't get too close and talk in somebody's face. There are probably a million examples of physical boundaries. If you want to add a few, that would be helpful to your colleagues in the back. Emotional and intellectual boundaries. So that could be, here's a good example, getting caught in someone else's world to the extent that you feel bruised, wounded, or battered. That is tough. The vicarious trauma that you all experience every single day in this work puts you at risk for this. And I will also say that it is not unusual to feel battered and exhausted and bruised at the end of some of these days when you've spent your whole day hearing really hard and painful stories. Other emotional or intellectual boundaries could be inappropriate conversations or jokes, telling people things about you that would not, that are not conducive to their clinical progress. So, for example, there was a caseworker that I knew who was a very young caseworker and very inexperienced, and one of the clients was having trouble with a mom who had serious mental illness and was being hospitalized. And this really triggered the case manager because he had experienced that and ultimately had gone into the foster care system and come out and was very rooted to the issue and very triggered by the issue, and ended up telling this client a long and very involved story about his experience with his mom that really had no real bearing, A, and B, didn't further the individual's clinical progress. So it was an inappropriate kind of emotional connection and sharing. Time can be unreasonable expectations. So somebody can't expect you to show up every single day and spend hours and hours and hours with them. You've got lots of clients and you've got lots of responsibilities, and time can really be an unreasonable expectation. What else? What are some of the other kinds of boundaries that you guys could name? So Melissa is saying, I find that sometimes if I don't know a person's diagnosis, it can be difficult to be properly supportive. That's interesting. And so that isn't really a boundary issue, although it certainly can be, because that's a hard one to ask. Julie Perkins is saying, we had a client that was losing her dog and it was a challenge. A huge challenge for her, I'm sure, and a colleague volunteered to take it. That was a great kindness. We've all known people who refused to go inside when they couldn't take their pets. So there are some gray areas too. So sharing your personal history, that's a real gray area. I tend to tell a lot of my personal stories, and they're helpful and useful insofar as they give insight to the person I'm talking to and help that person move forward in their own life. I don't share unless I see that it's going to be a tool that someone can pick up and use. Really, I suggest do not share your home number, but there are times when you might. Friending clients on Facebook, most of the time probably not, but again, you know, there may be times when it seems appropriate. Accepting a gift. I was in Alaska, and there was a client in the shelter who had learned from his father and his grandfather how to carve ivory into the ivory from, I suppose, walruses? I'm not sure. It was beautiful ivory into small totems. And he was very talented and very proud of this gift, and he made one for each of the outreach workers. And in that case, it would have been hard to say no. It didn't have monetary value so much as it had a value for him of honoring him as a person and honoring his history. So accepting a gift can be messy. Now, you know, I would say that that one is definitely a gray area that you may want to think really hard about. Certainly, you wouldn't want someone to hand you something worth a great deal of money or something that could put you at risk as a professional. Paying a client to mow your lawn, yeah, that's kind of a gray area. Working with a client when you're not on the job, sometimes emergencies happen. Maybe that's a gray area. What about clients who are no longer PATH enrolled? I think there's lots of gray areas you can think of. If you want to add a few in the box, that would be fabulous. I love seeing what you guys add. And I wish I had more time to, I will go back and read this stuff after the event. So thank you for taking time to do that. So I would really like you to just take a minute and type in some of the boundary issues you've had in setting boundaries with a client. So what are some of the issues you've had in setting boundaries with a client? And I'm going to ask you to just type for a minute, and then I'll read a few of them before we go on. Clients have asked me to transport them places in my personal vehicle. Yep, that's hard. having the client call after working hours, cultural boundaries, that's an interesting one, receiving compliments, clients wanting to give hugs or asking for money. That is a tough one because it's hard to say no. And yet that sets a whole different expectation and it can become problematic in a heartbeat. So caring too much about the outcome of a client's legal matters. Many clients test boundaries, and this is going really fast. This is a huge gift to me and to the rest of the community here, so thank you for putting these in, and I will be looking for them afterward. I will look forward to reading these. Sexual and harassing messages, clients asking about your personal life. So exactly. So I'm going to move back into the slide deck now and just say professional boundaries are the spaces between the helping professional's power and the client's vulnerability. I love this, so I'm going to say it one more time. Professional boundaries are the spaces between the helping professional's power and the client's vulnerability. The power differentials can set us up for exploitation, and it's a risk when relationships are unequal. Power inequity is always true with employer, employees, supervisor, supervisee, client, staff, and others. Adults, children, criminals, victims, teachers, students, and there are many other places. These are significant power differentials that can put you in a position to hurt or at least not to help. So people experiencing homelessness are so vulnerable. And I love this quote and often use it, but hurt people can hurt people. Your power comes from sitting in a professional position with access to private knowledge about your client and making clear boundaries helps us control that power differential and allow for safe connection. We need to be very strict with our boundaries, especially when we're dealing with highly vulnerable people. Healthy boundaries, here's just a little table, help us focus on our responsibilities, allow, I'm just going to go down through this because I'm running short on time, but they help, they allow, they ensure, they establish, and they encourage. We're setting up safe, open means of communication that are safe physically and emotionally, and that promote healthy behaviors, growth, and professional relationships. And that takes clear understanding of roles and expectations. What does a healthy boundary, what do healthy boundaries look like? It's safe. The relationship is supervised and you follow the rules, and that's transparent from the beginning. You can always fall back on your role. You can always say, you know, I'd love to lend you that $5, but I can't. It's against our procedures. It's against our policy. The relationship is consistent but flexible. And what you are there to do is promote growth, independence, and self-sufficiency. The focus has to stay on the client's needs. This relationship is not transactional. I will just add, too much self-disclosure really does shift the focus from the client to you. And that can be all kind of confusing. And I think I've already said this, but any personal information shared should be relevant and focused on advancing the care goals. Because role confusion really can lead to clients feeling betrayed or abandoned or angry or jealous. And the upshot is that they can then become unwilling to trust others because these are people who really have trouble trusting. Some red flags are disproportionate amounts of time with any one client, over-identification, or putting yourself in the role of a hero in the client's life. You are there to facilitate growth, not to save somebody. I think we're all aware of informed consent. This is the act of agreeing to allow something to happen or to do something with a full understanding of the relevant facts, risks, and other alternatives. These are necessary factors. Full knowledge and understanding are necessary to whether someone can give informed consent, but this consent applies to lots of situations, including decisions about medical care and legal issues. Dual relationships come up with the client provider relationship, and here's several examples of what you might expect to find in terms of dual relationships. You can see somebody from your church. Somebody could be in your church or your school or at the grocery store, the post office, or on the street. What do you want to remember in those cases? I'm going to encourage you to practice self-care because burnout is a significant danger in the kind of work that we do. These are some of the reasons why it's important to practice self-care. As helping professionals, you are trusted with your clients' darkest secrets, their hardest, saddest stories, and their most difficult life situations. And if you don't take care of yourself, you can burn out emotionally, mentally, physically, and those are some of the characteristics of burnout: cynicism, depression, and lethargy. And with that, thank you for letting me talk about this. It's one of my favorite topics, and I will hand it over to my colleague, Teresa Cooley-Bennett. Teresa, you're on.
Hi, everyone from Kansas City. Just want to point out that today's slides are over down below here. If you need to print those off or missed something earlier, or feel free to do that. But this portion of the presentation is regarding ethics. We're going to learn all about ethics, and especially as they pertain to individuals experiencing chronic homelessness, many who have severe and persistent mental illness or co-occurring disorders. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the potential ethical dilemmas that occur with the individuals that we work with, and we'll talk a little bit about some strategies. So what is an ethical code and why is it important? Well, all professions have an ethical code. These codes have many similarities. In addition, states have what's called licensing regulations. So those are different than an ethical code. Paraprofessionals or someone who's like unlicensed may not have an ethical code because they're not aligned with any one profession. But they should still be aware of what ethical considerations are, because even in agencies or when we receive funding, it's expected that we are ethical. So there's standards and guidelines that are required that are followed. So basically, I like quotes. So this is just a quote, that professional ethics are rules reflecting the values and goals of the profession. So why are ethical codes important? And so I have a list here from different professions and what they say about ethical codes and why they're important. The first one from the National Association of Social Workers states that some of the standards are enforceable guidelines for professional conduct and some are aspirational. And I'm not going to read every single one because you can print off your slides and you can read those, what these organizations are saying about the ethical code. But basically, ethics are a guideline that we follow. 3 C's for being ethical, or basically some reasons we should be ethical, are to be compliant with regulations, guidelines, standards, whether it's from funders, whether it's from our agencies that we work with, whether it's from our COCs that we're working with, our HMIS, our Homeless Management Information System, whoever we're working with, they're expecting us to be compliant. Also cooperative. We want to be cooperative with our agencies, our profession, our clients, our colleagues, our supervisors, and we also want to be covered. And that's something that we don't always talk about, but covered means that I want to be covered from litigation, from legal consequences of my behavior. And sometimes our behavior can lead to legal consequences. So we want to protect the general public and the public welfare, protect our clients, but also protect ourselves. So what do we mean when we talk about an ethical dilemma? So an ethical dilemma is experienced when professionals cannot adhere to their professional values, or when adhering to one ethic requires behaving counter to another ethic. So what do we mean by that? So, for example, an ethical dilemma could be that I am working with my client, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So one of our values and ethical guidelines is that clients have the right to self-determination. But there's also another guideline that says we want to do what's in the best interest of the client. And with the population that we're working with, individuals who are experiencing homelessness and all other types of chronic issues, there can be a time where what is in the best interest of the client, in maybe my opinion, is not what the client wants to do. So that can cause a dilemma, because I'm trying to figure out how am I going to handle this situation? Because if I let the client determine what they want to do, that's not really in their best interest. So then we have to weigh the consequences. We have to figure out how critical of an issue is this. Is this something that's reportable to someone? Is this something that I can just let the client make their own choice and the client will live with their consequence? But it can really become a dilemma where as professionals I know I've gone home at night concerned, thinking, I hope my client didn't freeze to death, or I hope my client didn't overdose tonight. And it can really cause a lot of stress for us as professionals when we're experiencing an ethical dilemma. So that's something to be aware of. And let's go to our next slide here. So difficult ethical dilemmas or tensions often are not explicitly addressed in professional codes of ethics, but they emerge as practitioners attempt to work with vulnerable populations, such as older women who misuse substances. Again, you can see I like quotes, and this just sums it up for me, is that we have tensions. It's not outlined in our code. We don't always know the answer. There's just like a lot of gray areas, and it can be really a dilemma trying to figure out what is the best course of action when I'm working with certain individuals. An ethical violation is when there's a definite violation in an ethics code or standard in which there may be legal consequences from a governing board or agency, and at times may lead to litigation. It's different from a dilemma in which a conflict is experienced in adhering to a professional value. So I want to make that distinction between an ethical dilemma and an ethical violation. a dilemma is a gray area. We're trying to figure out what is the best course of action, whereas a violation is we actually have violated an ethics code. For example, if I'm committing fraud, I'm saying that I'm doing an hour session with a client when really I only spent 30 minutes with the client. That's obviously fraud, and that's obviously an ethical violation. There's other ethical violations, like we said earlier, having sex with a client. That's an ethical violation. And many governing boards and bodies and even agencies, it could lead to litigation, firing, all types of things. So that's the difference. A dilemma is something usually that we're working out, trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation, whereas a violation means it's an act of violating something. Another example of an ethical violation is our duty to warn and reporting abuse and neglect. So as helping professionals, we have an obligation to report things like that. And so that's an ethical violation if we don't report what we need to be reporting. And sometimes it's a dilemma as well because we're not certain. We don't want to mess up the relationship we have with a client, but then at the same time, we want to make sure that we're keeping everyone safe. So, for example, I worked with a lady who was homicidal, and she was homeless, but she was doubled up at the time, and we were trying to get her out of the situation she was in, and she was homicidal. So there's a way to help individuals. So we just had a nice long talk about the situation, about what her plan was, what we were going to do, and she did agree willingly to go seek treatment at a hospital, which was really helped, and she had a lot of success after that happened, and just it really ended really well in this situation. So that was really fortunate, but it would have been a violation if I wouldn't have done anything, if I wouldn't have intervened and say she did try to harm someone else. So that would have been a violation on my part. So I had to do what I needed to do to make sure she was safe and other people were safe, but at the same time, being respectful of her as an individual, respecting our relationship, so working with her on that. Okay, so ethics and boundaries. Ethical issues related to professional boundaries are among the most problematic and challenging. Briefly, boundary issues involve circumstances in which social workers or any helping professional encounter actual or potential conflicts between their professional duties and their social, sexual, religious, or business relationships. So there's 5 categories of boundaries, and I heard our other presenter talk a little bit about some categories of boundaries, but there's intimate relationships, pursuit of personal benefit, emotional and dependency needs, altruistic gestures, and responses to anticipated circumstances. And then on our next slide, we're going to go through what those entail. So an intimate relationship, of course, is a sexual relationship, physical conduct, services to a former lover, intimate gestures. So we didn't talk about that yet today, but sometimes you may have had a relationship with someone in the past who then later ends up becoming a client. And so that's a boundary issue because you had a past relationship with that person, with that individual. And so then it's determining, what am I going to do about this? And having your boundary set. What I do is I would refer them to another worker. It could even be in the same agency, but I'm going to make sure that I'm not the direct service provider. I might even have to go to another agency. But I want to be sure that I'm keeping that boundary, because as we talked about earlier, there is that that authoritative relationship. Even though we don't want to always, we don't feel like I'm an authority or I'm in a power relationship here, we still are, just on the basis of what our role is, because we're the worker. And so we have a position of power. Even though we may treat everyone equally, we feel like everyone's on an even playing field, it's still not that way in the view of the client. And so we want to make sure that we keep that boundary there. Personal benefit, monetary gain, goods and services, useful information. So I've heard of, for example, professionals or helping professionals had their own side business, for example, where maybe they're selling vitamins or herbs or essential oils or just whatever, and they ended up like trying to sell to all their clients. So they were making a financial gain and personal benefit because they were selling things to a client. And even though the client may have wanted those things, it wouldn't be ethical for the professional to be the one selling those things to the client. Then the emotional and dependency needs. Sometimes extending a relationship with a client. So for example, the client is now housed and they're stable and they're doing well, yet you keep extending the relationship with them, even though according to your agency guideline or to your grant, once they're housed and they are established like with another agency or resource for support, but you continue to see that client because somehow it's meeting an emotional need. Promoting dependence with a client, confusing personal and professional lives, and reversing roles with a client. So all those things have to do with emotions and dependency. And so we want to make sure that we have clear boundaries. Altruistic gestures, such as performing favors, providing non-professional services, giving gifts, being extraordinarily available. And we've talked about some of this in our other presentation. To me, what matters is that we have a boundary. So for example, I worked in an agency once where the clients had it was a live-in homeless shelter, and the clients had a store where they could go buy items with money they had earned. And it wasn't real money and it wasn't a real store, but it was a way of rewarding them. And so at Christmas time, a lot of the clients would go to the store and use their money to buy gifts for the staff. And so they didn't pay anything for those gifts, and they were using money they earned. And they were using that because they wanted to give back. So we accepted that, but we usually, like one of the boundaries was we're going to keep the gift at work, keep it in the office to have it on display. Or if it's a coffee cup, I'll keep it at work, I'll use it at work. So that was one way we handled that. But that's different than a client going out and somehow having the money to buy a $200 watch. Those kind of things would be unethical to accept, like a really expensive gift that a client went out and purchased. And I know we were thinking about, well, with the client, that was their right to determine that. We don't want to hinder the relationship with our client. But at the same time, we need to set a boundary and just say, I really appreciate what you have done and how you were thinking of me, but I can't accept this type of a gift. Unanticipated circumstances, social and community events, joint affiliations and memberships, mutual acquaintances and friends. So we need to think about those kind of things. It happens all the time. A client shows up at the church you're attending. You see a client in the supermarket, all those kind of things. So you have to have a boundary. What I've done in the past was told clients I worked with that if I see you out in public, I'm not going to acknowledge you. If you want to say hi to me or acknowledge me, that's fine, but I'm not going to acknowledge you because I don't want others to connect us. And that's worked pretty well as far as doing that. But what I encourage you is just set your own boundaries and decide, this is a boundary that I want to keep, and this is really important to me. Okay. So according to SAMHSA, working with persons who are homeless entails many things. It's possible that you may experience stress or unrealistic expectations when working with this population. I really like this partial list. I really like the whole list that's in the resource that SAMHSA publishes. It's called Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that's SAMHSA. But it's from Tip 55, Behavioral Health Services for People Who Are Homeless. And they have some really good resources in that Tip 55. And they have a list of ethical considerations that are specific to boundary issues that you can look at. And I've listed a few of them here for this webinar. But some things that happen is a client's in a dangerous situation, so they refuse to go to a shelter on a frigid night, having to persuade a client to go to treatment, violating ethical boundaries or agency policies to meet the immediate needs of an individual experiencing homelessness, like giving them personal funds. Feeling guilt or helplessness adds to the temptation to violate the boundary. Reluctance to provide a service when an individual's priorities conflict with yours, and feeling disconnected from individuals who are demanding, needy, miserable, or overwhelmed. And that's a great list to review and look at and think about when you're thinking about your boundaries that you're having with individuals who are homeless. And I would really encourage you to, you can even download for free the manual or order it if they're available in print. But just read that list. There's a whole lot on the list and too much to put into the presentation today. But I just want to encourage you to read that. It's very helpful. So what are some prevention and tips for managing the ethical dilemmas? What helps you make an ethical decision? What resources are available? Who can you consult with? How do you manage conflict in an ethical way? And can you be held liable? And I'm going to say the answer is always yes. However, in our profession, the helping professions, we are sued the least amount of time compared to other professions. And a lot of people say, well, the reason is because we work with a vulnerable population, or we're helpers, we have good relationships with our clients. But the real reason that studies show is that the helping professions are sued the least amount of time because our clients know that we don't make as much money as other professions. And I just wanted to throw that out. But we can still be held liable by our governing bodies or others, and just by our agencies. So we just want to make sure we're managing our ethical dilemmas in the right way. So this is a decisions approach model, acronym decisions on the side, and then as you read through there, it just talks about some ways to make decisions. And determine the facts. Ethical considerations, are there standards that apply? Consider the impact of your values or the values of your profession, of your agency. Impact on yourself on the decision. Stakeholders, who are they? Who else is this decision going to impact? Incorporate professional literature review, other considerations, narration of your decision. So write it out or narrate it with your supervisor, and then secure and support your decision. In some cases, an apology may be in order when things go wrong with patient care, and sometimes it can help diffuse the tensions that arise when a bad outcome happens. So maybe there was an ethical dilemma, something went wrong with patient care, maybe a client was angry, they felt like you didn't treat them the same way you treated someone else, or someone else got a service or a resource that this individual did not get, and there was a lot of tension. Sometimes it just helps to say, you know, I am really sorry that this happened. I really apologize with what went wrong. And it can actually diffuse the tension that arises. So a concluding reminder from SAMHSA regarding ethical responsibilities is adhere to the established professional codes of ethics that define the professional context within which the counselor works to maintain professional standards and to safeguard the client. Okay. So some other tips I just want to share briefly because we still have a little bit of time is number one, when you're experiencing an ethical dilemma, it's always good to seek counsel from your supervisor, from other professionals in your field, and just to get some other counsel from outside of yourself, because sometimes when we're in a real ethical dilemma and we're really struggling, it can be hard to just determine where we need to go with that. So it's always good to talk to someone else about the situation. When you're in an ethical dilemma, always consult your codes, your state guidelines, and just the things we talked about in that decisions model. I'm going to flip back just really quickly because this slide here, I did have a YouTube video on here listed for you to watch later on your own. We're not doing any YouTube videos today, but it's just a kind of a little scenario that shows how an ethical dilemma was resolved. So I just want to point that out to you. And I really thank all of you today for attending this webinar and attending my portion of the webinar and the whole webinar. I think it's just really great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this back over to Kate Rio to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you, Sherry. You both did a fantastic job, and I don't think I've ever seen this much interaction in the chat box before. So let's go on to the first question because we only have a little bit more time. Regarding Sherry's comment about letting the client drive the bus, and if I am working harder than my client, then they are no longer driving the bus. What is a helpful professional way I could redirect my clients to doing more to help themselves so I am not holding so much of the responsibility for their successful housing or lack thereof? Sherry?
So sure, thanks for that question. Oh, nope. Can you hear me now?
Nope. Yep.
Okay. All good. So I think all of this work comes down to building relationships with the client. And I think one of our best tools is falling back on our motivational interviewing skills. And so if you say, for example, Sandy, I know you want me to ride the bus with you, but I just really don't have time today. So let's make sure that you know where to go and how to use your token and do a test run maybe. I think that it kind of comes down to, do you want this? And if the answer is yes, how can we help you get there? That is always an important strategy. I think putting it back in the client's court in a way that empowers is a good strategy. Terry, what would you add to that?
Okay.
You might be on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Hello? Oh, okay,
yeah.
Great. I'm sorry about that. So as far as letting the client drive the bus, I am really a client-centered type of professional. So I really do believe in a client-centered approach and just letting them drive the bus as far as where they want to go with their course of action, their treatment. I know sometimes it's unrealistic. Sometimes I know that it can feel like that I am doing more than they are doing, which I know was brought up within that question is, am I doing more than they are? And so again, just setting like those boundaries that I want to have in place of, I can do this much and let the individual client know this is what I'm willing to do, this is how far I can go, but this is where the line stops and this is where you need to go on.
Thank you. So Kate, I would just add one more thing. I would just add one more thing, and that is it might be useful to just engage in conversation with the client and say, this seems like the very next step for you. This seems to be what you've asked for, what you're moving toward. But if you choose not to pursue this, I can't do it for you. What are the consequences? And I think that again is sort of falling back into your motivational interviewing skill set and putting the onus back on the client. So I hope that helped. Back to you, Kate.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions that are similar. One of them, and I'll ask both questions before you answer, but what's some advice on maintaining boundaries when coworkers have broken them, leading the "it's our policy" reason to seem invalid? And then there was another one that says, what's a good way to address differing boundary expectations within the same agency, like office-based professionals not understanding outreach efforts include offering water, clothes, and their viewpoint? It is unethical. So what do you do about these conflicting things? And, can you offer any other advice on that? So who wants to go first? I'm going to ask both of you to answer this one.
Sure. Well, I can go first. Oh, good. Terry, you go, and then I will go.
Okay, this is Terry. And yes, I hear these kind of things happen all the time. It's not uncommon at all. And so one thing that's helpful, since I oversee a homeless program, is just getting the team together to have a discussion about what boundaries does this team want to have as far as the client care goes. I think that's a really good strategy. Also, as a case manager, outreach case manager in that role, I would definitely talk to my supervisor and just say, hey, can you help me with this? Without using names, of course, running it by the supervisor and just getting a little feedback there would definitely be something I would do. But I also totally agree with, I need to try to talk to my coworker, and I know they may say, well, yeah, that's the agency boundary, but it's not my boundary. That can be hard to hear and difficult to challenge, and that's when I would definitely go back to a supervisor or just consult with someone like outside of another professional maybe that I consult with, or a mentor, and just get some feedback on it. But it can come to a time, if it's a really ethical violation, then it may be a point where I need to go ahead and just report it to someone.
Great. Thank you. That makes sense. And this is Sherry. I agree with everything Terry said. I would also be a very clear communicator with my client and just say, this is, you and I are working together, and this is the way that I work, and I think it's important to be really clear that way. I also think the value of speaking to the colleague is important, and bringing the supervisor into it, because this is hard, and boundaries are messy, and this can be really gray. So this is complicated. So I think clear communication with the client and with other staff is the key there.
Okay, we don't have very much time left, so I'm going to try and quickly go through. We have lots and lots of questions, and I apologize to everyone who asked a question and we didn't get to it. Thank you just so much for joining, though. So we have a question that I think is really helpful, especially for people who are managers in the field. So as a counselor and social work educator, I see high rates of altruistic boundary violations. What do you believe is the motivation behind altruistic gestures from students and new graduates in the helping professions? And then to go beyond that, of how can I help them to recognize boundaries are so important, and that this might not be a good way of approaching your clients?
So I can start that one, and I'm
yeah.
Is that okay, Kate? So
yes, that's exactly what I was
going to ask. All right. So I will go back, not to sound like a broken record, but I will go back to clear communication is absolutely critical. And I think sometimes when someone is new to the field, they're brought to the field by their own empathetic, passionate, kind hearts. And you do want to help, and you do want to make a difference for people. And so you're willing to go the extra mile and do what it takes. But I think sometimes communicating what are some of the unanticipated outcomes if you pursue this course of action. How could it hurt? Will you be able to do it for everyone? I think just communicating in ways that sort of highlight why the boundary is there in the first place, why the policy or protocol is there in the first place is critical.
Thank you, Sherry. And Terry, instead of answering this one, I'd like to give you a different one. So someone asked, are there repercussions for those who step out of their boundary? So in both the social worker side and for the client side, what do you think about repercussions?
Yes and no. It depends, again, on how the boundary is violated. Is it like an outright violation that is totally ethically wrong, such as having sex with a client? Yes, there are repercussions to the client, to the staff person, to the agency, to a lot of people are going to be affected by that type of a boundary violation. There's other boundary violations that not so much. For example, one time in my younger days, I gave a client some bus money to catch the bus, and I didn't really want to do it, but it was like said, well, I can't get home now, I'm stuck here, and I ended up giving money to the client, and I struggled with that because it really was against my boundary to do it. But it was a case where there were other agencies involved and a state agency, so I just let them know what had happened afterwards so that they would be aware. So if you're violating a boundary, definitely, like I did, where I talked about it. I mean, I didn't try to hide it or keep it a secret, because I knew if I gave one client money for a bus, I would have to give every client money for a bus. And so that was how I handled that violation, is I talked to the worker about it.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we need to go. I see a couple of people had raised their hands and we didn't get to them, and there are other questions, but thank you so much for joining us. Here is Terry's information and how you can reach her, and once again, you can download the today's slide deck in the box right underneath the slides. Here is Sherry's and my email addresses, so please take those if you need them. Thank you for attending this webinar, and it will be recorded. A listserv, or everyone who registered will receive an email with the recording link.